Good morning, everybody. Hello. Oh, is that about the right volume level? Yes, good. Good morning and welcome to this session on using collaboration to achieve the SDGs, aka everything you always wanted to know about the SDGs or the global goals but were afraid to ask. We have a great panel here who will be able to illuminate this often talked about but not necessarily well understood topic. So, this is officially a breakout session. It's supposed to be interactive, and we're going to try and make it as interactive as possible given the room setup. I will be asking you to get up and move and talk to the people next to you in a minute. And we will also have the opportunity throughout the session to ask questions. I have been given a handy iPad here where your questions will come up, so you don't have, there is not going to be a question that is too embarrassing to ask. You can hide in the anonymity of the technology and ask anything, because I'm sure you're not alone in being in an organisation and your boss or your manager has said, align what we're doing to the SDGs, and you're like, I sort of know what they are, but help. This is hopefully the session that is going to be able to help you manage that. So before we start, let's take a little poll. Could we have a live poll up? So hopefully you've all been using your thumbs and fingers to do this yesterday and through. Could you please, just so we get a little sense of the room, could you please answer this question? I assume the answers will pop up in a live fashion. So which of these statements best describes you or your company's activity? Please be honest. Do you have it all sorted? Okay, show of hands, a little technical slip. Right, thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So, this is not embarrassing because you will not be alone. Hopefully you have heard of them because that's why you're here. But let's just see. Number two, let's see. Who's going to be brave enough? Has anybody not heard of them, don't know what they are, not using them at all? No. Number two, aware of them but not really doing anything yet. I'm expecting a lot of people to put their hands up here. No? Wow. Educated an engaged audience. You've reviewed them and a sort of mapping activity, but haven't kind of fully integrated them yet? Oh, that looks like most. Yes, great. And properly, really using the SDGs as an organising framework? Yeah? Great. The second. So, in that second bucket, right, speakers, that is your audience. Pretty well informed. Thank you. If we could... Or maybe I'm in charge of this one. Maybe I can move to the next slide. Yes, that's them. So, the SDGs. Before I hand over to our fascinating panel, I am just going to, just a quick 101, as the Americans say, on the SDGs. So they are, as you clearly know from that poll, a universal agenda and call to action to mobilise efforts to end poverty, fight injustice, tackle climate change, and ensure that nobody gets left behind. They were adopted in 2015 for achieving by 2030, so 15 years, and they sort of build on and extend the Millennium Development Goals. There are 17, I feel I should do this, there are 17 goals, which and underneath those there are 169 targets, which are you're probably aware of these, but the 169, and it would be great if we could get to some of that detail in today's session. I think a lot of talk about the SDGs is at the sort of higher level, at the 17. So below the 17 are the 169 targets and 230 indicators. We'll get to that. They integrate all aspects of sustainable development. So that's what's clever about them: the social, the economic, the environmental, and the point is that they're an organising framework and principles that help us all align and work towards achieving them. So we all need to align: government, civil society, us as individuals, whichever hat we have on. The idea is that if we all align and work towards these and contribute to them, that will help us get us to where we need to be by 2030. So broad brush, that's what they are. I'm sure you all knew that. Let me get to the interesting bit now and turn over to our panel. So could I ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, explain who they are in a few sentences, and then answer the first question. And I'm going to ask a few questions to our panel, then I'm going to come to you, I'm going to check the screen. Please be ready with your questions so that everybody gets what they need out of this session. So I would like to ask the panel to to answer how they think the SDGs are useful as a framework after they have introduced themselves. Steve, let's start with you.
Okay, I'll just do the introduction. My name is Steve Gibbons. I'm a director at Ergon Associates. We're a research and consulting organisation on business and human rights.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Barrientos. I'm a professor in global development at the University of Manchester and have worked in this space, done research mainly in this space with workers, smallholders, informal workers for about 20 years.
Hi, I'm Steve Kenzie, Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. Global Compact is the UN's corporate sustainability initiative. Shall I? Do you want to?
No, you go.
I'll carry on with the question.
We've got two Steves, it's not at all confusing.
So Global Compact, our foundation is built on 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor standards, environment, and anti-corruption. And we advocate a principles-based approach to the goals, and certainly it's a great strength of the goals. I think while they were signed by governments, and ultimately the responsibility and the commitment has come from national governments, it is built into the goals and expectation that governments will seek support from all their stakeholders in the achievement of these goals. And there's an explicit call on business to contribute. But because everyone's involved, I think the real value in it is it creates a common language and a shared agenda. And so it really almost handing us Goal 17 on a platter. We're all working towards this agenda. It just natural then that we're going to come together in partnerships to bring it about. So for me, it's that common language, common agenda, common objectives that is the real value in this.
Thank you. Stephanie,
Yeah,
what do they do for you?
I'm especially working in a global development institute, so I'm really focused on the sort of development side of this. And I think what the SDGs, really building on what Steve said, it's not just as a common agenda, but it really creates a space in which both governments and international organisations, but also very importantly business, and we can get on later as to how, but where business can also play a role. And following on from the session earlier today, collaboration is essential, but then the question is how you collaborate and how you engage and at what level. But the SDGs, in my view, really provide a framework, and particularly just in terms of the kind of one dimension that my main area of interest is on the gender dimension, which is Goal 5 in the SDGs. But as has been consistently said, and I think it's also critical in business as well, if you don't have gender equality, none of the SDGs will work. So it's a sort of cross-cutting theme, that not only a theme in itself or a goal in itself, but also it has to work across all the SDGs for the whole sustainable development agenda to move forward.
I think for me, partly is what both of you said. In terms of collaboration, I think what they do is they pull together sort of responsibilities and actions by public actors and private actors. But also, I think there's a couple of things for me which make them useful and important. One is that they're aspirational, that they are goals and they are targets. They're looking about changing things and bringing about change. And the last 2 days we've already heard lots of speakers, and I won't add to them, to say, auditing and the kind of things that Sedex does at the core of its business is really important. It needs to be there, but it doesn't give us lots of aspiration. I think Juliet's point in the last session of saying, starting with an audit is like starting a relationship by working out what's wrong with each other, was a really good point. And I think the goals say, what are we aiming for? What are we aiming for in terms of climate change, in terms of forced labour? And we're looking at progress. And I think that's very important. And also I think that they're well aligned with other important concepts. Most importantly, I think sustainability and climate change, they're core to this. Equally, I think on gender, I think it runs through it, but also rule of law. And I think in that context as well, it's important to say that they only really work for me in the world we're all in, if you look at these alongside the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as well, which we'll come back to. But they give you a framework and a process. These give you something to aim for.
Something to aim for, exciting, thank you. Thanks for setting that out so nicely, all of you, and so clearly. So could you then build on that and talk about how they are, and Steve, you just touched on it just now, how they are different to what we've all been doing to date?
Yeah, so I think for me, the difference is one is that they, rather than what we do to date, where not always, and I think there's some great examples, and we heard some already, of collaboration, and it's almost thinking about the conversation from David from RB yesterday, and with a number of our clients, we have this issue that they become concerned to collaborate. It's kind of something to get over. Can we do it ourselves first? And then, okay, if we can't do it ourselves because it's an endemic problem, there are structural issues, there are cost savings, then we collaborate. Collaboration is built in. There's kind of an assumption that you collaborate, and I think that's right. And I think, Steve may be able to explain more, but I think Alliance 8.7 on forced labour is a really good example where you've got really broad collaboration. But also picking up on the point I made earlier, certainly when we work with clients around an SDG framework, I think the focus on change and impact and putting that front and centre, the first thing is that what change and impact can you make either yourself or collaboratively, and how are you going to do that? What's the roadmap towards bringing about change? And the advantage on the range of sort of potential goals and targets you can aim for this, I think is really useful. And I'll just take one little example is around living wage. And a show of hands, how many of you over a number of years have been working on living wage? Yeah. How many of you don't feel frustrated after working on living wage all that time? So 2 people don't feel frustrated, yeah? Do feel, I was changing hands there. So
it's going to be stand up, Taylor.
But I think the issue on living wage is that there is lots of ways that you can look to address poverty. Wage is one element of that. And looking for technical solutions to wage and looking for finding the perfect figure or auditing to the perfect figure may be one part of that. But I think some of the initiatives we've worked on actually building livelihoods and building the possibility for actually keeping more of the money you're paid through, for example, financial literacy work with women workers in India and Bangladesh, means that the wage paid is still the same, but they just weren't getting all of the money. Other people take the money from them, quite often, male relatives. Now, the question is you can work on other things apart from traditional labour and auditable things to make people less poor. That's just one example I give.
Thanks, Steve, for getting practical. And in this session, we're going to start quite high level and then obviously get more and more practical and tangible. Stephanie, how are the goals different to what we've been doing?
Yes, and I think, obviously, again, coming from a development background, what the SDGs replaced were the Millennium Development Goals. And firstly, they were just focused on poverty. They weren't looking at that broader issue of sustainability. But I think also very importantly, and because I've worked in sort of a lot with companies over many years, there's always been a disconnect between, or long been a disconnect between what happened in the development world and then what happened in the private sector world. And people just tended to be working in their silos. But I think what's happening is you're getting increasing recognition that the two that are interconnected. And I think, again, bringing out the sort of gender dimension of it, if you think what the SDGs do is also provide a framework. Companies might not be able to do the sort of thing that the UN will do or the sort of international bodies will do, but they can certainly do a lot working through their own global value chains. And women are absolutely critical in that. They're critical as consumers, 70% at least of everything that's bought. The actual customers who buy goods are women. Women play a critical role all the way through. Depending on the sector, women are anything between 50 to 80% of the workers in supply chain. They're often the most vulnerable workers. So if you're looking at issues around risk, if you're not addressing gender issues, forced labour, for example, the majority of workers simply for forced labour for exploitation, the majority, nearly 60%, are women. So if you're not having a gender lens, then you're not going to be able to really start to address the issues that you want to do as a company, promoting CSR, promoting human rights, etc. But the other side of that, and why I think it's so important, and where the SDGs really do help companies, is the causes of discrimination are deeply embedded within the social norms of the societies in which you both source and you sell. So companies can never really address those, and they go back hundreds and hundreds of years and exist everywhere. You're never going to be able to address those kinds of issues in isolation. And I think, the example of social audits, for example, social audits have really failed to date on issues around gender equality. If you look at the figures, less than 1% of non-compliances relate to gender discrimination in any form, less than 1%. For me personally, that is simply not a reflection of the reality, because if you look at other kind of ways of assessing these things, such as the Better Work programs, assessments, this is in countries where anything up to 70% of workers say gender discrimination is an issue for them in the workplace. So there's clearly a big discrepancy. But the big challenge, therefore, is how to move this forward. And you're not going to be able to do it on your own. But at the same time, then, what kind of alliances, what kind of strategies are needed, and how to move that forward. And I think the SDGs provide an important framework, along with the UN Guiding Principles, which have taken their time to get to gender, but have currently got a working group which will be reporting in June to make gender a more important aspect of the UNGP strategy as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Great. So it's so important, that interconnectedness as well. So it's that overarching framework, and then how they connect. Steve, how are they different to what we've been doing? What do they add?
So certainly another aspect of the interconnectedness, I think, is the global-local component. The MDGs didn't apply to developed countries, and so it allowed, certainly for UK-based organizations that wanted to engage with that agenda, and perhaps notably DFID, the orientation was all to how can we improve conditions outside of the UK, taking for granted perhaps too much that we're already fairly sustainable in the UK, making a huge assumption there, as we see now that we start to look at SDGs in a domestic context. And that is an ongoing problem, of course, that SDGs in the UK sit within DFID, who have an explicit international mandate and don't have a domestic mandate. And we've yet to really see that sort of domestic uptake here driving change in our own country. The interconnectedness piece, I think, is critical. We've seen how, Stephanie's pointed out how gender runs through, but also I think what's really important about SDGs is the explicit acknowledgement of the trade-offs that we have to make here. Goal 7 calls for energy for all, access to energy, and the knock-on effects of that, well, you need the lights on so kids can study, so there's a impact on many, many other goals, but at the same time, on the negative side, if that energy is coming from hydro, and that's having an impact on water supplies in a water basin and impacting agriculture. If it's coming from coal, it's impacting on climate change. And so the goals really do force a conversation about the trade-offs that inevitably we need to make. And I think what it leads to is really a call for systemic change that's lifting all. We need to be making progress on all of these goals in order to achieve any of them. Too much of a focus on any one is going to undermine the whole agenda. And I did have another point that I was...
What do you think? Can I just jump in with something
Yes.
on that? Because I think an added value here as well is actually where and it'd be interesting to see people in the room who've worked on this who answered the fourth question. The added value, I think, from the SDGs is within businesses is where the conversation can take place. Because I think you can take conversations about the SDGs right up to the top of the business. Now, Steve is currently sort of dealing, if you want one, he's got a bag full of them, these nice badges, yeah? Which are all ethically sourced, I'm sure. But you can get CEOs to wear this badge to Davos. That is not a problem, yeah? You can get them to go and talk about their aspirations and start to get them to think about really interesting things like, impact-based sourcing. Do you source from women-led businesses? Which is a really interesting question. You can do immense change by that kind of activity. You can get them to talk about that interaction between, as you say, sort of, fighting child labour and climate change. My experience is you can't get sort of C-suite people to go and talk about your audit programme or your labour standards programme, and it's really hard to even get them to talk about human rights programme. This is somewhere where they feel comfortable, but the idea is get them there, get them feeling comfortable, then start pushing the comfort zone. Yeah.
And I think a factor in that it goes back to the SDGs pedigree, if you will. I mean, they certainly were a continuation from the MDGs, but the MDGs were born out of a small group of experts in the UN. The impact that they had was enough of a clue that the follow-on couldn't be created in the same way. And so coming out of Rio Plus 20, where the strapline was the future we want, and that's really where we got into at the SDGs, the consultative process that was undertaken to get us to this point was so comprehensive that there's a legitimacy to this agenda, and of course the fact that all 193 countries have signed up to it. It makes it something exactly that a CEO can comfortably buy into, and of course getting them beyond just wearing the badges is possibly easier said than done, but it's an important starting point because clearly it just, the thin edge of the wedge, I think, and something that we can exploit.
Yeah, great. So before we get to the challenge of going further than just wearing the badge and getting your CEO excited by this, I want to pause for a minute and turn to you. There are no questions on my iPad. Now, just in case this is a technical flaw and faults that we had earlier with our polling, are there any? Yes, please. Just the mic here. You can ask anything. So you see we have a panel capable of answering. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jingjing. I'm working for HSBC Sustainable Finance. And I think it's definitely a great idea to encourage your suppliers to set some SDG objectives. But for a lot of big companies, the reason they set SDG objectives, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes they face a lot of pressure from customers, they face pressure from competitors and also from society, but it's not always the case for small SME companies alongside the value chain. So what kind of incentives do you need to give to the suppliers for them to set some SDG objectives, and do you think who should give the incentives to suppliers? Thank you.
Thank you. Take one more. Do you have any more questions? There was another. Yeah, let's take these three questions here and then back here, and then I'll let the panel answer.
Hi. I've always been confused by the SDGs because it feels as though if you use a materiality approach to understanding what your responsibilities are, then that drives your activities, and I completely accept that different areas and agendas intersect, for example, decent work and gender, etc. But are you really saying the answer to my question is that this is just a way to present this to our CEOs to make them feel good? Because that's surprising. And if it's not the way, then how does this intersect with a materiality-led approach?
It's a good technical question. I love it. Right, with one more question, and then we're going to let the panel answer.
Back in our company, we banana growers, right? We have approached we are off the grid, and we approach several practices to save environment, to make environmental efforts. We are also hiring lots of women for our packaging plant. But the thing is that I feel like the SDGs are sort of a mandate. And I think the messages, if the message is positivized, it can have more power. For example, for us, women labor is better. For certain detail, they are more focused on detail. So, and besides the energy problem, for us, it was solved with solar energy because it was cheaper and it's easier to have in faraway places. So I just I don't know if there's any sort of effort to make the message a little bit more approachable,
Great.
not as a mandate.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Over to who wants to go first?
Question.
Yeah,
Shall I
thank you,
take first?
Stephanie.
I mean, I think that's a very important question, and I think it goes back to what Steve said earlier about the sort of global to local. Clearly, big multinational corporations will be addressing the SDG agenda partly often because they're engaged at a global level. I mean, if you look at an organisation like Unilever or others, they're actually directly engaged. But for many smaller firms and suppliers along the value chain, that's not the case. But I think very importantly, is there's increasing evidence. I mean, what the smaller firms can do is do what they do well, aware of what the SDGs, of the links, if you like, to the SDGs. So again, if you take the gender piece, which is a cross-cutting theme for all of them, there's increasing evidence that in firms that have small as well as large, that have greater gender equality, they're much more likely, this is McKinsey's research, much more likely to perform better commercially. They're much more likely to have higher staff retention, and they're much more likely to be able to produce quality goods and therefore upgrade within the value chain, if you like. And so I think that's where you've got to kind of focus, that there's the global, the meso, or the national, and then there's the local. It's where do you fit into this framework? You're not going to be working at the global level, but you could certainly be contributing at a more local level. And that it's all firms moving in the same direction that will create the critical mass that will help to move the dial forward and contribute to the SDGs.
Great.
Maybe I'll grab the second one. So I think I'll take the materiality and then the CEO thing. Yeah. So I mean, certainly the way I see it, and I think it's one of the reasons we all called out UNGPs as well, is I think either on materiality assessment or salience assessment or whatever we want to call it, I think that process, when done well, is both looking at, it will look at things like reputational risk, sure, but it looks at what your influence and impact is on the world, yeah, in the broadest sense. But also, I think when it's done really well, it looks about not just that from a risk perspective, but on your ability to affect change. Yeah? And I think the SDGs are really important because I think, as Steve said, we can look at these 17, but it's the targets underneath where the magic starts to happen, and even below the targets. But where can you influence? Where can you bring about change? And that will be focused. It won't be on all of these. Yeah. But I think the intersections, what it does force you to do, is to say, well, if we take this approach, are there some knock-ons? Are there some other impacts, whether environmental or social, that you need to consider? But again, if you're doing the materiality assessment or impact assessment well, you should do that anyway. On the CEO point, I don't think I was saying that this is just sort of puff for CEOs. I think what I'm saying is this gets their attention. It's what you do next when you've got their attention. I think there's a good sort of micro example of that we've seen a few times in the last 4 years on modern slavery. With some companies, the fact that they have to write a modern slavery statement has really forced the board to engage, look at budgets, look at timelines, look at resources, look at responsibilities. That's a very small number, but it's more than before simply because you got their attention. As we know, particularly if you get a group of CEOs together and they're in a room, with governments as well, and they genuinely can be forced, and that's about everybody working around them rather than them, to say, make some commitments. And then I think, as the point was made, it's how you follow up on those commitments that's important. But I think it's an opportunity that wasn't there before to make high-level commitments.
I have comments on all.
Yeah, go ahead.
All three. So just first one, around the SME piece, I started my career running a small business, and personally wanted it to reflect my personal values, and I think that's true of many small businesses, that the directors want to be proud of it and don't want to be doing anything that they wouldn't do personally. So I think there's an inherent morality there that smaller companies don't necessarily need always a cash incentive, but also I think there is a business case as well as a moral case probably for every one of these goals. And finally, on incentives, I think this is something we're actually actively looking for, is that larger companies will be drivers of change through their supply chain by putting pressure down the chain and creating incentives insofar as, if you want to do business with us, we would like to see that you're contributing to our objectives around the SDGs. So I think there are a number of aspects around how SMEs might be motivated to engage on this. Around materiality, I think that there's both questions of materiality and salience come into play here in terms of deciding where to go, but as Steve pointed out, that's a bit more of a risk-oriented approach to the goals, and I would equally say there's a lot of opportunity here. If we actually believe that these goals are going to be achieved by 2030, well, then that is a very different looking world to the one we're in right now. And so how does your business fit into that future world? How do you get there? What sort of product service offerings should you be starting to think about with a view that this is the direction that we're going in? And there are many companies already finding value in associating their business activities with this agenda. Probably others will know this better. I hope I got it right, but I know there's an example that I often use around Unilever and the Lifebuoy soap marketing in India, where well proven that washing hands 5 times a day with soap dramatically reduces mortality from waterborne diseases. So for a soap company to align their marketing with a social good clearly makes sense. There's a huge opportunity in there. So I think there are similar opportunities. I have a company I work with that makes paving stones that have started developing a permeable paving stones that combat flooding in urban areas. This is looking ahead to the future and identifying opportunities. And this agenda can be a useful tool to flag up where there are markers. Knowing that every government has signed up to this, expecting that government policies will start to align with this and shape the business environment in which we work, I think it's a rich source of opportunity in that.
Great.
Finally, on the last question, I'm not sure I quite...
It's really aligned with incentives, because what I was trying to grasp is if there are efforts being done on this, improving the positivity for business-wise, for aligning with the SDGs. You know, because I really believe that if you give a financial or productivity approach to it, you can reach the goal
Yeah.
better. You can push.
So I think this is going to be different from country to country. In the UK, the government's approach has been to call upon every department to incorporate the SDGs into their single departmental plans. And policy is being influenced in that way. So it's not been a particularly high profile yet, but that's evolving as the government gets more engaged, and perhaps maybe soon will be less focused on other things. So every country will be different, and those governments will be approaching the goals in different ways. With multinational companies, though, that is a bit more unifying, and I think where we see companies establishing targets for themselves, they will be projecting those through their supply chains. Whether that takes the form of incentives proactively, or rather the more ominous one, we're doing this, if you want to do business with us, you need to do that too, I think will remain to be seen.
Great. Thank you. So I had an activity here, and I think I am still going to do it, but I'm going to slightly change what we were planning. Could you go into different, can you hear me? Yes, great. 4 different groups, sort of a group over here, if you spin your chairs around. Sorry, I know you might not want to do activity, but I think it will just sort of liven us up. So go into the 4 corners, and if you need one in the centre, we can have 5 groups. It's just going to take 3 minutes, so it's going to be really fast. Could you look at the 17, decide which, in your company's, your activity, you want to sort of aim which ones right now in your own activities you are focusing on, which ones you are contributing to, and vote which are the most important. And just have that discussion amongst yourselves and have a discussion about what questions together you want to about what questions you want to ask the panel, because then we're going to pick it up. I have got some questions that have come through here, but they are questions for other sessions. So I'm relying on you, and thank you for your questions so far. So I'm just going to do this for a few minutes. Could I ask you to get up even and just turn, have a discussion, talk about which you're having the most impact on. I'm going to ask for some interesting observations after the session, and then just decide on some interesting questions to ask this really knowledgeable session panel. And we're only going to do this for about 3 or 4 minutes. Go. Hello. Hi. Stay where you are for a minute. I'm just going to go around each of you, and then I'm going to ask you to go back to your seats. So these are good conversations. Good. Carry on with this afterwards. This group here. You can stay where you are in your group if you want, and then I can ask you to, if you could stay where you are for a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to come back to your seat. So this group here, what was anything interesting, different? What did you vote for? Any question? Anything that come up? You think number 12? Okay. Consumption?
Yeah, there were other ones there that are just as important, but about number 12 is about, we felt you can actually control that.
Control it.
Yeah.
Great, number 12. Any more for number 12? What do we have? You a group? Number 1?
No, we said 3, 5.
3.
Sorry, we said 3, 5 and 8, but you couldn't actually walk away from 15, 14 and probably 10, and that's the whole point is they're all interconnected, so...
They are.
That's the trouble, but I think sort of 3, 5 and 8 gives you a good basis to work from.
3, 5 and 8 for your group. Great, thank you very much. Group over there, at the back. Anybody? Were you arguing about which were the most?
Yes, and I suppose we're looking for assistance on actually how you go about deciding which ones to do, because we had quite a diverse range of businesses, all of which had maybe picked some, but actually they were all different, so to pick one was very difficult. And we had some that haven't necessarily done that, and it's, how would you go about doing this process?
Let's hold that question and ask the panel, shall we?
We shall,
in a minute.
yes.
Let's do that. Great. Were you a separate group? Yeah? Anybody want to add some votes, priorities?
There were a few of us in this group who work for food companies, and I think one of them which seemed to appear quite a lot was number 12. So again, I work for Ella's Kitchen, so a big one of ours is focusing on packaging and food waste. And that resonated with a few people in the group, so that was quite a big one for us.
Great. And an example as well of getting people in the same industry together to work, to align and work together and collaborate. This group here.
Well, we all started by choosing a different goal. I don't know what sectors we come from. We didn't get to talk about that. But faced with the choice of skipping lunch or choosing a number, yes. we all decided on number 12. Number 12. Oh, great. What a great example of consensus building there. Good. I would have loved to have been in that conversation and seen how tricky that was. Thank you very much. Obviously, this is the kind of conversation we need to be having, isn't it? Within our companies, within our industry, and with different multi-stakeholders. Over to our panel. How do you do this? What is the process? And give us. So let's. Oh, Steve, you've done this. You've held many people's hands through this. Let's get a bit practical.
I think. Listen, I caveat, I'm a rent-seeking consultant, so I will start with saying, start with a matrix, end with some PowerPoint slides. That's the obtuse way to do it, but I think really, literally starting with a matrix to start to map and say, what do you do? What is relevant to you? What the kind of things you're talking about? What isn't that relevant for what you do? Where do you need to work with other people? But I come back to the point, where can you actually bring about change and impact? Because I think that's where we get real stories, that's where we get actually real people's lives on the ground are changed. And they can also give rise to those kind of benefits that Steve was saying, that there may be some marketing advantage you get from it, there may be other business advantages you get from this. Now, as far as tools are concerned, I'll just call out 2. Because Sedex have done a really good publication which actually sets out the SDGs and also sets out a number of business cases as well and case study examples. I'm not sure how well it's known. Yeah? Similarly, ETI have done a really good publication looking from their specific perspective, only dealing with labour issues and supply chains, what the overlap is with the SDGs, where the relevance is, and also some ideas on first steps to going on this. So I think you do have to start off by doing a big table. It's as simple as that. That's the simplistic start. I'm sure my colleagues will be more nuanced.
Stephanie, can you add?
Yeah, no, I come at this as a researcher, but I think a lot, particularly again with the gender focus, gender lens, a lot is beginning to happen. There's a lot of interest. I'm working with a very large DFID program, WOW, as it's called, Work Opportunities for Women, with a focus really on global value chains. And that is just entering its second year and building partnerships with different companies. And I think one of the key focus to promote women's economic empowerment in value chains And one of the key things is to really look at strategic and systemic change. So if you take things like issues around sexual abuse, discrimination, etc., there's a lot of evidence, and certainly some companies and some sectors, that as women move into leadership positions, as you get more women supervisors, more women in management, then you alongside other changes as well, then you begin to systemically address the problems of discrimination and sexual abuse, rather than simply see it as a sort of a negative issue that needs to be clamped down. You positively change the environment. And certainly if anybody's interested in more information on WOW, do come and see me afterwards in terms of sort of how to expand that kind of program. And I've seen a lot of some examples of very positive change, and certainly one example was in Kenya Flowers, where quite major changes took place, and that led not only, and that comes back to the questions that were raised earlier, not only to improvements for women workers themselves, but also business improvements in terms of raising productivity, moving up the value chain. And I think if we can get more and more examples of that, then we can begin to get that systemic change, all of which contributes to the SDGs. And if you get women in leadership, I'm sure women are, as well as men, but women especially, are often concerned about environmental issues, about a much broader sustainability. They're often very concerned about the future of their children quite actively.
Thank you, Stephanie. Steve, so the process and the tools, so just getting practical, and then we're going to go to examples after that.
One more tool
Yes.
would be the Stg Compass. It was developed really with the passage of the goals in 2015. It's a UNGC, WBCSD, GRI collaboration, so it's got everybody in it, if you know what any of those letters stand for. But anyway, many of the big global actors in sustainability produced it. I think it's www.sdgcompass.org, and that's a useful tool. I would endorse Steve's approach of a matrix, but I would strongly encourage you to not do it at the level of the goals, but rather at the level of the targets. It's really essential to get deeper. When you look at zero hunger, what are you going to do with that? When you get down into the targets, then you'll start to see actually stuff that you as companies could impact on. There's malnutrition more widely, so obesity starts to enter the frame, which is a more perhaps pertinent domestic issue. Improving the viability of smallholder farmers is in there. There's a lot more richness, and that's really where the essence of the goals sits. You could be doing something great on education, but if it actually doesn't line up with any of the targets, you're actually not contributing to the SDGs. So I think it's really important to go in with your eyes open. What are the targets in the area in which you would like to have an impact? Understanding both your negative impacts and where you could have a positive impact is also critically important. If you're only looking at where you might have a positive impact, that's a big blind spot that you want to address.
Question here from the audience about tools for the business case in particular. Have any of you seen any material out there that relates to creating a business case for the SDGs? Any recommendations on that?
I think that's somewhat in the... So the thing is, none of these are new issues. None of this, gender equality as a problem. The gender pay gap didn't arise because the SDGs have colored it and made an icon for it. These are all issues for which a strong business case already exists. And so I think the SDGs enhance the business case because now there are more people looking at it, and there's more reason than there was before to act now and have an impact before 2030. But the business case for having a diverse board has always been there because they make better decisions. Having a business case for the SDGs, having values and principles in the way your business is run will attract better quality employees. The business case is there, and I think all of these things, there's none of these issues that didn't exist before. So I think these tools will help to further clarify what the case is, but yeah, I think.
Of that, with some real examples, and also can you include in, I think some of these questions we've already answered, but also if we take the first one, yeah, exactly, that's where I was going, we've got some more likes for that top one. Should the SDGs be the main framework for responsible sourcing strategies? So that's touching again on the high-level framework. Could you then illustrate that with what people are doing on the ground and how you embed that? Because at the moment, lots of us are part of managing or being managed as through responsible sourcing strategies of companies. What does this look like?
Well, I mean, for me, the question, yes. I mean, I think it should be the main framework for a strategy. Now, this isn't saying it's defining your standards. It's defining how you actually get to your strategy and design that. So I think answer there, yes. To give you a specific example, because you asked for specific examples, and it's a gender-based one on a project we've been working on with a client in Papua New Guinea on gender. And though any of you know Papua New Guinea, you know, the levels of gender-based violence are just off the scale, completely off the scale. So the client there has been working from a number of dimensions over a number of years. And they decided to actually use the SDGs across a range of their business. And how it played out, so I'm going to talk about the outcomes as far as gender is concerned, that they looked at their own business and they looked at both harassment protections, training, sort of promotion of women to leadership positions, all of the things that you would expect. And I think they do it quite well. But then they looked more broadly to say, well, what can they do? How can they use their business to impact on domestic-based gender violence? So they partnered with their security provider and said, as well as establishing independent sort of women's shelters throughout PNG that had never existed before, and said to their security provider, you will, whenever you get a phone call through the hotline number, you will go and you will take this woman and her children to a place of safety. And when the security provider said, how much are you paying? They said, this is a condition of your contract. So nothing. So they realised they could go wider by using their business, and then they realised they could even go wider and use advocacy. So they have set up the first gender-based violence march that takes place every year, which they sponsor and support. And they've also, it may be a bit trite, but in a sports context, and I do a lot of work in sport, they decided they would become the prime sponsors of the PNG Women's Rugby League team, and rugby league is the biggest sport. And they said, actually, the change for lots of the men in the business by them taking that step has been just one extra factor. So what they've done is they've gone broad and wide, and the SDGs approach allowed them to actually go much broader than they would have done previously.
Great, thank you. Very quickly, Stephanie and Steve, could you give a practical example?
Yeah, no, I think, and really just to build on Steve, I mean, I think going back to that first question, even if you're a small or medium company, if you make, and there's again evidence of it, that when companies make positive improvements within the workplace, and a small company can only often work within their own workplace. So, for example, addressing issues around health and safety and environment and chemicals and protection, etc. That learning then goes into the households and into the wider community. So you might, as a company, only be able to directly intervene in your workplace, but if that then leads to workers not washing chemical pesticide clothing that's being used for pesticide spraying, not to wash that with their children's clothing, that is a positive move in terms of widening out. So I think it's always doing what you can do, doing it better within the framework within which you work, but thinking about the potential implications on. And when it all builds up, then you build up to the SDGs.
Leave us on.
Yeah.
No pressure.
That Unilever example was my go-to for this sort of thing. I also like to pull out just a living wage. Steve raised it earlier, and I tend to think of it more in a domestic context. But there's an agenda that pre-existed the SDGs. There is, in many cases, a strong business case for pursuing it. And it links up with Goal 8 perfectly. And so there's something that, a practical step that companies can take either within their own offices or encouraging their suppliers to do it. That's perfectly aligned with SDGs, but also stands alone as a responsible business measure.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I think we did get some... I felt bad breaking you up when you were having those conversations. Please do continue with the conversation. As you know, with these things, you're going to learn lots from talking to each other. How do you do this? How do you get beyond your CEO wearing the badge? Please continue. And kind of like Mark wants to come up and say a few words, I think.
Henri, thank you to the panel. Let's show our appreciation. It's a very, very simple announcement. Just we're closing this session. Thank you for the participation for it. Lunch is now served within the same place that you've been having all of your various different breaks. Just a quick promotion. At the bottom there, you'll see the Sedex annual general meeting. It's taking place between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the Balmoral room, which is the room immediately beside the Grand Hall. You're very welcome. All members are very welcome to come and join us for an update on the business performance, where we've come from, where we're going, and an opportunity to vote on the member elections for 2 vacancies which we have. So all members very, very welcome. Thank you very much indeed.